Chiew Hui Ho is a senior lecturer in East Asian Buddhism at the University of Sydney and a former graduate of this program, of the PhD program here at Stanford University, where he wrote a dissertation titled Tales of the Diamond Sutra, Buddhism on the Ground in Medieval China, which formed the basis for his first monograph, Diamond Sutra Narratives, which we have here, published with Brill in 2019. He's also the co-editor of the volume Buddhism and Violence and the author of articles in the Hualin International Journal of Buddhist Studies, Religion Compass, and the Journal of the Society of Asian Humanities. Chiew Hui has studied and taught in Hong Kong and Japan, in addition to his current appointment, and is the recipient of several research prizes, including the China Times Young Scholar Award, the Chiang Ching-kuo Doctoral Fellowship, and a Japan Foundation Fellowship. He specializes in Buddhist practices of the laity in medieval China and their effects on textual reception, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, and that will be also the basis of a talk that he's giving for the Ho Center tomorrow on the Tong biography of the Lotus Sutra in parasutraic writings, or subtitled, How Does a Scripture Live? And I suspect we'll get a bit of the answer to that question, that subtitle question, as we go forward. So welcome, Chiew Hui, to the podcast, and welcome back to Stanford.
Thank you.
I gather this is your return after 12 years, after the point where you defended your dissertation. And I thought that would be a nice place to start to talk a little bit about the graduate school project that took root here. That sounds like was the origin point of this methodology that you've then pursued through multiple projects of taking an interest, of course, in the sutras as core text, but especially in what you call parasutraic writings. So going into this conversation, I suppose there's a ground, there's a grounding question of this Buddhism on the ground topic that we will get into that we should ask, which is, what is a parasutraic writing? Could you describe, that corpus to us? And why did it pique your interest? Why did it grab your attention when you were doing your graduate studies here, such that it has formed an engine for you for multiple projects?
It didn't actually form like in the initial phases of my doctoral research because the idea actually came much later. I mean, I was actually concentrating on the tales, and then we are calling it miracle tales. But then I tend not to call it miracle tales because I think it's underpinned very differently from uh, usual miracle tales in a Western sense.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I started out, it all started with actually a course with Paul.
Paul Harrison.
Yes, right. So we studied the Diamond Sutra and then writings related to the Diamond Sutra. And then, so that's when I was exposed to the tales. And so Paul introduced the tales to us and we read the tales. And the tales are all very interesting to me. And after serious considerations, I decided that it will be a topic for my doctoral research, and that's how I started. And I don't have a methodology. I don't know what they should be called, and those things actually came much later,
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense.
especially the parasutraic part. Yeah, and essentially, I think it's necessary to come up with this term to sort of talk about tales. And so the first thing I did was to talk about why they shouldn't be called miracle tales, because they're underpinned very differently, with a very different worldview. Um, and the next thing is parasutraic. And we tend to concentrate on, traditionally, we tend to study a lot of commentaries, writings that are directly about the doctrines of
Hmm.
the sutra. And but then when we studied the tales of the Diamond Sutra, we discovered that the tales are not often that most of the time they have nothing to do with the Diamond Sutra philosophically, doctrinally, and then they are not commentaries. And then during my research, I also found that there are other writings that are very similar to these tales. They might not be directly related to the Diamond Sutra. It could be someone writing a praise um, on an event related to the Diamond Sutra. For example, someone writing a praise about Emperor Shenzong, writing a commentary,
Hmm.
but then nothing about the content of the commentary
Hmm.
or the content of the Diamond Sutra. Yeah. So there are these writings are related to Diamond Sutra. There's no um, explicit
Yeah.
content of the Diamond Sutra. So these are writings that they circle around the sutra. They encourage people to take up practice of the
Mhm.
Diamond Sutra, to engage with the sutra.
Right. So you have this phrase that comes up in your research, both with, I think, with regard to the Diamond Sutra and the Lotus Sutra, of being a sutra practitioner. And so I understand what you're saying, where you're saying that the commentaries are different from the corpus of parasutraic writings that you're looking at, where a commentary presumably is saying something about the content or philosophically engaging with the propositions that are there in the sutra. Then there's this other distinction that you make, and you make this in your writing as well. Against the against miracle tales, against jiguai, I guess. Could you say a little bit more about the distinction on that side of things? What assumptions might we bring into this if we called them miracle tales, and why would that be misleading compared to what you are reading and what you're seeing?
I think it's necessary to talk about the tales in relation to Zhiguai and to miracle tales, because we have miracle tales in other traditions as well, in the Western traditions as
Mm,
well.
hmm.
And then one of my question is how do they differ, right?
Yeah.
These Diamond Sutra tales. And Zhiguai is because there are many people who actually call Diamond Sutra tales or Buddhist tales of these sorts, right? 自怪, but they are not 自怪.
Hmm.
Yeah, and because well, the reason why it's mixed up with the genre of 志怪 is because we have the earliest collections of Guanyin tales
Hmm.
from the period when 志怪 was actually very popular and flourished. Yeah, and some scholars when then they mix them up together and they call everything 志怪, including the Buddhist tales. Yeah, so I think at least we have to differentiate it very carefully because 志怪 they have their goals are multiple. Buddhist tales, their goals are very directed. They
Hmm.
encourage faith, they encourage engagements, and so this is a very obvious difference in goals, right? And I find it necessary to differentiate that. And with respect to miracle tales, miracle is how do we actually it's a translation problem. I
Hmm.
discussed with Paul, and Paul is very particular about translations and I think is a good starting point because you have to really describe it well with a label, right? And but if you call it miracle tales, just like Western miracle tales, then we can't really find out what its true nature is, right? And therefore, yeah, I start to think about it, and then I start with there are actually some literature on Buddhist miracles or super knowledges, superpowers, and
Hmm.
how are they related. So in the Buddhist worldviews, they are all related to somehow related to practice.
Hmm.
Yeah, and to the superpowers achieved and is related to spiritual attainments.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's very different.
Yeah. Could you give us some examples just to start us off of ways in which characters or historical figures are engaging with the sutras as it were sutra practitioners or in other forms in parasutraic writings that would be maybe neither miraculous nor commentarial that is more distinctive to this corpus? What kinds of ways does the sutra get invoked, or what kinds of ways does the sutra get used?
Not miraculous in the usual way, right? For example, you well, let's talk about the practices
Hmm.
first.
Sure.
In the tales, usually the practices are related to recitation, reading, copying, and recitation being the most common. And there are tales of devotees who recite the Diamond Sutra, and one of the things that characterize the corpus that I study, usually they really encourage people to really recite a lot
Yeah.
of the Diamond Sutra, and it's very different from the Guanyin stories. The Guanyin stories usually you you just call the Guanyin when you're in trouble. Sometimes they are not even practitioner in the first place, but the Diamond Sutra tales are usually about people who have engaged with the Diamond Sutra for extended period of time.
Mm.
So then there'll be different sort of things that they will encounter, and usually the stories could be very formulaic. There's a sort of like a prelude telling us that the person practiced, engaged, and recited the Diamond Sutra. There's some problem he or she encountered, and there'll be some sort of solution. The problems can vary. I mean, it could be meeting a tiger on the way in a mountain, and then the tiger not attacking the person.
Mm.
Yeah, and or from someone surviving a boat capsize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In both of those cases, by nature of that person being protected by having undergone a practice of reciting the sutra, perhaps?
Yeah, right. So then you look at, oh, okay, are there people who survive, drowning?
Yeah.
Of course there are, right? So, but then the tale is written in such a way that it prepares and prime you to interpret it as a sort of a sort of miracle,
Yeah.
but it's a wonder, right?
Yeah.
So, but then miracle in a Western sense, and especially with David Hume, right? Um, from his time, is usually interpreted in such a way that it's related to the powers of the great intelligence,
Hmm.
right? And then it's usually externally applied.
Hmm.
But then the Buddhist tales are usually internally applied because the
Mm.
trigger is usually the person him or herself, right?
Yeah.
That you got to recite the sutra to call forth these things. And then there's another concept that you bring in, because of the merit that you have accumulated that enable you to survive drowning. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's some matter of internal training, internal piety is probably the wrong word, um,
There's,
but
of course, there's a sense of piety as
yeah,
well.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it's not an intercession by a deity on one's behalf or by a saint or something along those lines.
If ever, it is because of the devotion, the piety, the recitations that actually call forth that help.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this leads me nicely to my next question, which is sort of about looking at the celestial versus the terrestrial, because you mentioned humbly that you felt like a methodology or perhaps a scholarly perspective or angle was only in formation in your dissertation, and I take that point. At the same time, the subtitle to that thesis, about being Buddhism on the ground, is one that then returns in the introduction and opening chapter of Diamond Sutra Narratives, and does seem to be a sort of motivating scholarly perspective for you, that you are staking out a way of looking at this religion and a scope about that. So, can you tell us about that choice and how that commitment has evolved over time?
Yes, I mean, I actually wrote in the introduction that I think was introduced by Ninian Smart, and in response to how we take up religion and how we study religion, and it's still the case that and traditionally, people concentrate on major figures in Buddhist histories and talk about the great things that they do, but then nobody is doing research on what common people were doing on the ground. And so there's this huge gap. And of course, it is difficult to study pre-modern periods and what people are doing.
Sure.
And but I think it's possible to actually do it through the tales,
Mm.
especially when we have a lot of evidence in relation to the Diamond Sutra because of the Tunhuang manuscripts. We do have many manuscripts related to the Diamond Sutra, whether they are actually, like, for example, paratexts like colophons attached to manuscripts. Yeah, and they can be studied for what people believe and what people were actually doing and in relation. So the study of the miracle tales in itself is insufficient to actually throw light on because there's this questions of whether they are true or false. But then when you can supplement with other sources, then you'll be rich enough for you to at least make some inferences about what people were doing on the ground. And therefore, given that there's a gap and there's an opportunity to look at these tales through other materials to sort of come up with a picture of what people are doing, then I think it's worth engaging with Buddhism on the ground, which is still lacking. Yeah.
Yeah. And I take it that's one of the things that's front and center for you when you think about now as your projects move forward, going from the Diamond Sutra to the Lotus Sutra and having also the Garland Sutra there as a sort of third point of comparison, is it seems as though as you're looking at the parasutraic, you're also interested in these kind of structural parameter related questions about what can we chronicle almost in a quantitative sense about what we see in the protagonists of these stories and who these stories might be meant for in terms of an audience, where some of the parasutraic texts that have maybe more to do with the Diamond Sutra than the Lotus Sutra might involve laity more than monastics or vice versa, and that might imply something about who these stories were meant for or who might found the most inspiring, and where the laity was drawn in terms of one sutra or another. So can you tell us just a little bit about, now that you're working on the Lotus Sutra more specifically, how you see that distinction?
Um, let's begin with we can only make conclusions based on what we have, and sometimes they might not be true reflection of actually what actually happened on the ground. And I can only say based on what available evidence I have.
Of course.
Based on Diamond Sutra, because there are obviously a lot more lay representations, that, and therefore, and we know based on the manuscripts in Tunupang, there are many lay engagements, and then but the Lotus Sutra parasutraic writings, the two collections I've talked about, they're actually very different. Um, uh, One of them traditionally has been taken to be a miracle tales collection, but it's not.
Hmm.
Yeah, the Hongzhan Fa Hua Zhuan. Um, because when I read it closely, some of the stories, there are no miraculous content. They're basically about someone who just engaged with the Lotus Sutra and then his life. That's all. Yeah, and so there's no sort of content of wonders at all. Yeah, so they are not comparable to the Diamond Sutra collections I've studied.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but they are still parasitic writings of the Lotus Sutra because they are about and they encourage faith in the Lotus Sutra.
Yeah. If anything, it sounds like they are more distinctly parasutraic writings as opposed to miracle tales or some other designation we would give them.
No, they are both are parasitic
Mhm.
because they circle around the scriptures, except that they are you cannot say that is is a collections of um, accounts of wonders.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely, because not all accounts,
Yeah. Even if they're
yeah.
compiled as such, is there a reason why they're compiled as such?
Um, well, that has got to do with the goal of the collections, because the collections usually the compilers are very specific about what they want to achieve with the collections, and sometimes you have paratext within the collection, within the parasutroic text
Yeah.
itself
Yeah.
that will tell you, right, the prefaces, the colophon.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That will
and
tell you what to expect, but it sounds like they might also mislead you in certain ways, where it's sort of like, oh, if you go forward with this, these are all kind of in the realm of the miraculous, but in fact, they turn
I
out to
think,
be.
when you say that they mislead you, when you are misled, it's because of yourself. I
Ah.
think it's just because you don't read it well,
Mm.
because we are at a time, we're considering the time, right? Yes, they have papers they to write, but they don't write effortless. Like, they don't have abundance of paper like us, and pen and write easily, right? They still have to. It still requires effort, right? So they are very specific about their tasks and their goal and what they want to achieve, and they are very economical in the way that they write, so they have
Yeah,
to express a lot of things with fewer words than us.
I see.
Yeah,
So
just like in
you get these rubrics that are maybe more capacious than, or yeah, or to us would mislead us, but that's because we haven't done a proper job of kind of putting
yeah,
ourselves back into
yeah.
the time.
So if you read them carefully, I think it's possible to know what they are for. And so the way that are titled, my stance and is that the way they are titled tell you what they are all about. So 红赞法华传, right? So or Chuan, right? It's basically, if it's a miracle tale collection, it'll tell you 灵验传, 灵验记, 应验记, 应验传. And so the title actually will tell you what you're supposed to take it to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if they don't call it 自怪, don't call it a 自怪. That's my point, and
Mm-hmm.
don't get mixed up.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this case, right, when they call it a 传, and then or 传, right, and then we have the 法华传记 or 传记, right? So they are already telling you how you're supposed to understand them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we can sort of try to understand them based on that character.
Yeah.
And you roughly know that it's related to Chuan, transmission, or Zhuan, which is biography.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a problem, right? If you were to say a biography of broadly promoting the Lotus Sutra,
Hmm.
that would sound a little bit strange. But it might not be strange if you attend the talk
Yeah, yeah, I think we'll
tomorrow.
come back to that at the end
Yeah,
of this interview
yeah,
and with the talk tomorrow. So these
yeah.
texts are already telling you, you know, you've mentioned in your writing that like a big corpus for you is the Tiantai patriarch biographies, right? So sometimes we are talking about biographies of specific people
Mm.
who have relationships to the sutras, but it sounds like you're saying the language of the titles of these texts is also is already suggesting to you
How
that
you
these are
should take them.
biographies of sutras themselves. Is that right?
Uh,
Or almost something along those lines?
that's my argument
Yeah,
for tomorrow's talk, and I have to demonstrate to you how you can actually pass it in such a way.
yeah.
But and now that's a problem of translation. You see, the English is very restrictive, but Chinese, right? There, you if you write that character, put it that character, if you can, I can read it Chuan, and you can read it Chuan, right? And Irene can read it differently, and yeah, so that's how I think it was meant to be. Yeah.
That there's an ambivalence built
Yes.
into the
Right.
character itself.
Then and in fact, the collection itself, contain all these different connotations.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's a sort of a boundary
yeah.
and a way, and but it's not a 灵验记, it's not a miracle tale collections.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, just to pause for a moment on the kinds of outcomes that do come from these engagements with the sutra that we might not call miraculous, but that are very important from a Buddhist cosmological karmic perspective. It seems like one of the things that you've hit on is not just, and I love this, that the paratexts and the parameters of these parasutraic writings already distinguish them between Diamond, Garland, and Lotus Sutras, but that also there is nevertheless also within the content of these stories something that's distinctive about the Lotus Sutra stories, which has to do with accounts of different forms of heavenly rebirth that are given to different kinds of practitioners based on the level of their engagement with the sutra. So could you tell us about the different realms one can be reborn into by nature of having this Lotus Sutra practitioner practice? And what do you learn from the fact that different patriarchs or different monastics land in different places with regard to this variety of engagements?
Um, actually, this question is interesting and important in such a in a way that because it actually make me think of things that I never really write in that article, and
Mm.
which I might not give you an answer now.
Hmm.
Yeah, but now that you bring up this the afterlife abodes, right? Is something, if you're talking about what really distinguishes these different parasutraic writings of different scriptures, right?
Yeah.
This is one of them because um, in the Lotus Sutra collections, you'll find that people will have afterlife, people die, and or they have good rebirth. Usually, it's not named in the Diamond Sutra collections, but the Lotus Sutra collections, in the Lotus Sutra collection, they make sure that they name, like going to Tushita, Trayastrimsa, right?
Hmm. They're more
And or
specific about the abodes
and
given.
yeah, the Pure Lands, right? And sometimes there's comparison. For example, or someone recited the Lotus Sutra X number of time, and then the parent is reborn in certain heaven, and then the parent came and said, or if you were to, recite another X number of time, I'll go to the Pure Land, I'll have an upgrade, and so there are this kind of things going on. So there seems to be some sort of, some sort of the hierarchy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Is it being codified in that moment as to like what you
mm,
have to do to end up in certain abodes?
no, it's usually right because the text is about the Lotus Sutra. So the focus is always on the Lotus Sutra,
Mm.
meaning that okay, how many times that you recite, and then you can have an upgrade, things like that.
Yeah.
But then you because you also ask what specific things they do to be reborn into Shita or the Pure Land, right? I might have actually missed out because you can actually probably look closer and see, for example, this story about Lotus Sutra recitations and someone being born in Tushita, for instance. How Maitreya actually was featured in the tale. So that's something that I didn't focus on in that article,
Mm.
and I can actually go back there. I mean, if I'm writing a book on the Lotus Sutra, I finally go back and do more refined
Yeah.
scanning, right, of the text and see whether it's always is does Maitreya ever even appeared in um, a tale where the protagonist gain rebirth in Tushita.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Do you have a hypothesis about what you might find if you
I
comb
I
back through for that?
I don't want to give a premature sort of, but my hunch is that basically it's still based on the Lotus. But if there are, I believe there might be a few cases that
Mm.
but we might not be able to see a pattern. But a
Yeah.
few cases might be able to give us a theory.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
it sounds like what you're saying overall is the emphasis is not on the devotion or the labor of the practitioner. It's always on the power of the Lotus Sutra,
Yes.
and that power of the Lotus Sutra may not necessarily be predictable or reducible to kind of mathematical earnings of, how many times you recite it and therefore get these kinds of rewards. Is that
But the more you recite, the outcome is always better.
okay?
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So there is at least some logic you can follow. You can put your
Y-
trust in.
Yes.
Okay, that
Yeah.
makes sense. Well, okay, so thinking about the Lotus Sutra more generally, I do want to come back to this idea of there being a biography or a lifespan of this particular text and of the particular parasutraic corpus as well. I know this is going to be the topic of your talk tomorrow, and to get the full argument, we'll have to take that in at length and ask you questions about it. But can you give us a little bit of a preview or an overview of sort of how you see the lifespan of the Lotus Sutra by way of its parasutraic writings in the Tang Dynasty? Where does it begin? Where does it end? What are its phases?
Okay, let's start with the prehistory of the research because, as I was, telling you before, um, Donald Lopez actually wrote Lotus Sutra biography under the Princeton University Press. So it makes me think about, yeah, how can a sutra has a biography? How do you talk about a sutra
Yeah,
having a biography?
yeah,
And then prior to that, when I was writing my dissertation, and of course I mentioned the two Lotus Sutra collection, I actually have some trouble translating the collection's name.
mm.
And if you look into my book, I think you can sense some sort of yeah, it's not totally well done.
Were there other translations you entertained that you could have
Um,
gone with? And
I just feel it wasn't something that I was totally satisfied with,
mm, mm.
for sure. Yeah, and maybe that lingers on, and then when I see a biography again, right, it makes me think about because it all lingers with the word chuan.
Mm.
Yeah,
Which what else could that word mean if not biography?
Because that word is available in Chinese, and in the if you are talking about historical writings, it usually refers to biographies of people.
Okay.
Yeah, right. So because Sima Qian, he started this new 纪传 T, right, to apply in in historiography, and so he introduced this zhuan genre, talking about the biographies of people that he collect in his history,
Mhm.
the Shi records of the grand historian. So this is something that he sort of pioneered. And later on, these genres were taken up in various, and of course, it's also taken up in Ziguai, because some accounts of Ziguai, they comes in, the biography of people, and of course in Buddhism as well, and became very big. So Sima Qian, in some sense, has a sort of great impact on how we write biography, and so this term is used and is applied to people. But as far as I know, like I don't think we talk about a biography of a, like in a Chinese sense,
Yeah.
biography of a text.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that's why we have trouble when we try to translate
Hmm.
this term, especially in the name of these two collections.
Yeah. So I hear that as the story of coming to terms with this term and this generic, this genre category.
Mm.
Can we say something about there being the story of the the years themselves, these kind of medieval years where this parasutraic literature is developing? Is there something like an adolescence, a maturity, an end, a rebirth? I know you write about perpetual renewal of this tradition, but in what way might it have a lifespan or a life evolution?
Are you talking about biography of
Now
a
I'm talking
text?
about sort of the parasutric writings themselves,
Okay,
or
if
yeah.
you're talking about parasitic writings, right? The parasitic writings come about only when um, people want to propagate this scripture,
Mhm.
or it started to gain some ground,
Yeah.
and then people are aware of it and then wanted to push it further, right? So it must have some sort of beginning. So
Yeah.
people took notice of it, and in my book I said that one of the reason is because it was made available in the public domain, in
Mhm.
inscriptions in monasteries, and so that people can see, and that's how people gain knowledge of it. Not just the monastics or
Yeah.
people who have um, access to a book, but people who maybe illiterate but could see it actually, and then ask people, "What is this?"
Mhm.
Right. So it might have started from that sort of beginning,
Yeah.
and then people started to collect these tales, and then that's the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah,
What does it go from there? Once the people have hold of it, once it's a sort of publicly available text and not a kind of cloistered one,
yeah.
what happens to the text going forward from there?
It'll be a sort of a snowball effect. People, as people get to know about it, more people start practicing and then engaging with it, and
Mm.
then the people start telling people, others, their
Yeah.
experience, and then as more and more of these accounts proliferated, then they come to be compiled.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then the Lotus Sutra practitioner work that we might associate with particular patriarchs or with monastics starts to be something that other people, including the laity, feel that they can participate in as well.
There's actually a distinction between the Diamond Sutra and the Lotus
Oh,
Sutra
okay.
collections, because the Diamond Sutra, as I was saying, right, we have a lot of things, evidence, I would say.
Yeah.
But the Lotus Sutra is from what we can see,
Yeah.
there's of course fair representations of lay engagements, but then it is much less than
Not to the same
the
extent.
Diamond Sutra
Yeah.
for various reasons. I
Yeah.
mean, it's more extensive, more difficult for people to engage.
Mhm.
But anyway, there are still shorter versions. For example, extracts, like a certain chapter that's very famous, the chapter on Avalokiteshvara. So that's practice, and that's a legitimate form of practice
Hmm.
as well. And so and you'll find that in collections, there's some representations of those those sort of practice, and engaged by lay people as well. So in nature, it's very different parasutraic. So you can say that it's broader in its scope. It contains accounts of wonders as well as non-accounts of wonders,
Yeah.
and maybe and something else. For example, Hongzhan Fa Chuan started with the category of of image. So it talks about fashioning a certain landscape related to the Diamond Sutra, or a bodhisattva found in the Lotus Sutra, and then it is this fashioning is replicated in China.
Hmm.
So it's telling the tale about how important landscape and sacred geography is how important it is in Lotus Sutra cult.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is something that is totally not related to tales of wonders, right, or biography.
Right.
So this is something. So it's sort of broader.
Yeah, it's a detail that's
Yeah.
maybe
And
more.
then the Fawa Zhuangji is much broader, as I'll say tomorrow. Yeah. So there are other things. Yeah. But I know you're interested in, history and what is the different. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm curious about that, and I think that's maybe where we will end. Is just so you take this idea of there being potentially a biography or a lifespan of a sutra from Donna Lopez, but also from within the texts themselves. They seem to be suggesting that language to you, and I suppose that feels quite different from saying, "Oh, I have a chronicle, I have an archive, I have a history of a text." To say I can tell the story of a life of a text or the biography of a text feels quite different, and I wonder just. How you conceive of that. Is it useful because it offers biological analogies of sort of like, oh, here's the maturity of a textual tradition, here's the health of a textual tradition, here's the, as you say, the propagation of a textual tradition? Is it more because it feels like it has interpersonal analogies? Oh, here's the social status of a tradition, here's the identity or self-recognition of a tradition. I guess I wonder what kinds of things as a scholar are offered to you by thinking in terms of life and biography as opposed to maybe more neutral categories of history, chronicle.
I think when we yeah, when we talk about biography, right? Usually we talk about a person from birth to death, and then their it's actually chronological, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and basically a biography tend to be historical, more or less, right?
Hmm.
And when we are talking about biography, and my idea of biography as it applied in the Lotus Sutra is somewhat different. It's not just from point A to point B and then it ends. It doesn't actually end.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of my argument. And what I want to argue is it is actually a pre-modern sort of biography written. And the idea of object biography, because I mentioned that before, it's interdisciplinary field taken up by museum studies, anthropology, who try to account uh, for the life of an object, not
Hmm.
just as an inanimate thing, but having agencies and being able to influence things, and um, being an agent itself in the way that it influences people. And so from that perspective, we can actually see that there's some sort of a presentation by the compiler of Fahua Zhuangzi in such a way, presenting it in such a way that it's not a usual kind of biography of a person,
Yeah.
but then having agency, having some sort of influence. But then it's really also interesting because in the very beginning, deals with the ontology of embodiment. Yeah, how it is. And by the way, when in Buddhism we're talking about cosmic time, it's not just the time in the human world.
Yeah.
And so and that very beginning is not specified, with
Yeah.
or in which year, but it says that the Buddha expound the Dharma, and expound the Dharma, and it's so expensive that you can't contain it. Yeah,
That's
but
go ahead.
you can actually put it in. you can actually do it somehow, contain it somehow. But this is always the, a very Buddhist way of expressing things.
Yeah.
Not being able to contain, oh, it's so expensive, but then you you still manage to contain it for people. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it started with explication, expounding the discourse. Yeah, and not in just verbally. Yeah, not in any texture form,
Mhm.
but in Fawasansi, you will come to see that at a certain point in time, you will be committed to writing, and then you will have influence subsequently. So you can actually see that the compiler has some sort of an idea about the Lotus Sutra having agency, um, and it actually appears, it appears according to a rhythmic theory of time in Buddhism. It actually will arise, it will matures, and then it will be concealed because the conditions are not right,
Yeah.
and then it will manifest itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really clarifying. So I was thinking in these terms of biography being a known generic entity that, of, like you say, describing the beginning of life to an end and then imposing that as a way of giving order onto an otherwise potentially amorphous, difficult history of a large corpus of parasutraic text. But it sounds like you're saying in multiple ways, we actually need to think about it in the reverse order. We need to think about the ways in which that Buddhist history and that parasutraic set of writings as changing our sense of biography, that
Mm.
it changes our sense of biography because we change our estimation of what counts as a living active agent in a story. It might not just be the practitioner, it might be the Lotus Sutra itself, and it changes our notion of biography because it changes our notion of time, that this is something that is reborn across multiple generations and has renewed life and vitality and importance in a culture, not just in the course of one lifespan.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, so the way I want to close then is just to ask you, where are you taking this model, this heuristic in your research going forward? You've done the Diamond Sutra and the Lotus Sutra. Do you imagine continuing on with parasutraic writings and their biographies with other texts and parasutraic sets, or or is this starting to inspire new departures and offshoots?
It, Yeah, I have other ideas, but then I haven't finished because this is just the beginning. And for tomorrow's talk, I'll not go into the accounts of wonders because we have no time. But I only have time to talk about why it's a biography and explain why it's a biography. But this is just the beginning because it's incomplete because um, this biography is supported by a system, and what I call a system is a system of faith and devotions that is actually sort of encapsulate in the categories of engagements. The collection is divided into 12 categories, and the remaining six are actually those are related to how you engage with the scriptures. I think if you want to really talk about, because biography, the way that we have it, right, require us to look at how it's not just how people take up, it's the relationship between the text and the people, and how do you unravel the relationship. You really have to study the accounts in these categories very carefully, right? So this collection is very big, so there are hundreds, and so to to finish up, I think I'll have to really read them very carefully.
Yeah.
And as I said, they are not that formulaic compared to the Diamond Sutra. So
Mm.
there are a lot more variations. So which means it's harder to interpret them or to see patterns, and so it requires more effort. But I think this idea can be applied to other texts in Buddhism and Buddhist studies, for example, esoteric texts,
Mm.
the Pure Land text as well. Yeah, so in its application, it's very wide. But unlike a traditional human biography, which will be about the life of a person, the scandals of the person, blah blah, blah, the biography that you see in Fawa Swansi, as I will demonstrate, will not be the same as a biography that was the biographical patterns that you can actually see when you study other parasutraic
Mm.
writings of other sutra.
Yeah.
Yeah, so um, It's a lot more work, but in its application, I think it can be done to other texts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that makes sense. But also it makes sense then that you'd be in the thick of it with the Lotus Sutra for quite a while because of the eccentricities and the varieties within.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful. Well, we look forward to seeing how that research evolves in the coming years, but especially how we can learn more about it tomorrow in the talk that you're going to give, a talk that we're also going to be recording and putting on our YouTube channel. So thank you so much, Chiew Hui, for having this conversation with us, for explaining the ins and outs of the parasutraic corpus of the Lotus Sutra and the life therein.
Yep.
This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.